hotel here. I don't know why that sounds like that's simpler than it sounded in my head, but anyhow, we are today reading chapter 7 and 8, and I promise this time I am not backtracking. I hope no, I'm not backtracking. We are reading chapter 7 and 8, and then afterwards we will only have the last chapter left, which will be sort of grand finale. So if you have any suggestions for the next book or articles you want me to read, please drop them below in the comments, because I honestly don't know what I'm going to be reading. I have some ideas, but yeah, I am reading the worst book of fiction at the moment. And otherwise I'm reading this, which is probably not relevant to anyone who's not French, but is this guy's Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is running to become president, and I don't know how many times he's done it. He's done it a lot of times, but yeah, he's been all over the left in France. He ended up creating his own party, which, what would be the translation of that? It would be the insubmissive France or something. I'm not sure. Anyhow, probably not relevant to English speaking crowds. So please, if you have any suggestions, let me know. And am I doing 3,000 things at the same time? Yes. And I'm not sure how the stereotype about women being able to multitask was born, probably because they were multitasking given societal roles on women, etc. But it's a stereotype that I don't like in general because of historical reason and feminism, but I like multitasking, so I'm not sure where I was going with this. But anyhow, I look like I have a neck brace, but I don't have a neck brace. I'm completely fine. I'm just cold. And at the same time, I was like, I want to have a bit of spring, hence the little head handkerchief or whatever you call it. But I'm fine, right? All of this being said, let's get started without any further ado. Chapter 7 and 8 of Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher. Chapter 7. If you can watch the overlap of one reality with another, Capitalist Realism as Dreamwork and Memory Disorder. That's the title. Being realistic may once have meant coming to terms with a reality experienced as solid and immovable. Capitalist realism, however, entails subordinating oneself to a reality that is infinitely plastic, capable of reconfigurating itself at any moment. We are confronted with what Jameson, in his essay The Antinomies of the Postmodern, calls a purely fungible present in which space and psyches alike can be processed and remade at will. These guys didn't even know about NFTs. See? Anyhow, the reality here is akin to the multiplicity of options available on a digital document, where no decision is final, revisions are always possible, and any previous moment can be recalled at any time. The middle manager I referred to above turned an adaptation to this fungible reality into fine art. He asserted with full confidence a story about the college and its future one day, what the implication of the inspection were likely to be, what senior management was thinking, then literally the next day would happily propound a story that directly contradicted what he previously said. There was never a question of his repudiating the previous story. It was as if he only dimly remembered there ever being another story. This, I suppose, is good management. It is also perhaps the only way to stay healthy amidst capitalism's perpetual instability. On the face of it, this manager is a model of beaming mental health, his whole being radiating a hail fellow, well-met bonhomie. Such cheerfulness can only be maintained if one has a near total absence of any critical reflexivity and capacity, as he had, to cynically comply with every director from bureaucratic authority. The cynicism of the compliance is essential, of course, to preserve assiduously enforced. What this disavowal depends upon is the distinction between inner subjective attitude and outward behavior I discussed above. In terms of his inner subjective attitude, the manager is hostile, even contemptuous towards the bureaucratic procedures he supervises, but in terms of his outward behavior, he is perfectly compliant. Yet it is precisely workers subjected to disinvestment from auditing tasks which enables them to continue to perform labor that is pointless and demoralizing. The manager's capacity to smoothly migrate from one reality to another reminded me of nothing so much as Ursula Le Guin's The Light of Heaven. It is a novel about George Orr, a man whose dreams literally come true. In time-honored fairy tale fashion, however, the acts of wish fulfillment quickly become traumatic and catastrophic. When, for instance, Orr is induced by his therapist, Dr. Haber, into dreaming that the problem of overpopulation is solved, he wakes up to find himself in a world in which billions have been wiped out by a plague. Very Thanos of him. A plague that, as Jameson put it in his discussion of the novel, was a hitherto non-existent event which rapidly finds its place in our chronological memory of the recent past. Much of the power of the novel consists in its rendering of this retrospective confabulation, whose mechanics are at once familiar because we perform them every night when we dream, and so on. How could it ever be possible for us to believe successive or even coextensive stories that so obviously contradicted one another? Yet we know from Kant, Nietzsche, and psychoanalysis that waking, as much as dreaming experience, depends upon just such screening narratives. If the real is unbearable, any reality we construct must be a tissue of inconsistencies. What differentiates Kant, Nietzsche, and Freud from the tiresome cliché that life is but a dream is the sense that the confabulations we live are consensual. The idea that the world we experience is a solipsistic delusion projected from the interior of our mind consoles rather than disturb us, since it conforms with our infantile fantasies of omnipotence, but the thought that our so-called interiority owes its existence to a fictionalized consensus will always carry an uncanny charge. This extra level of uncanniness is registered in The Light of Heaven when Le Guin has Orr's reality warping dreams witnessed by others, the therapist Haber who seeks to manipulate and control Orr's ability, and the lawyer Heather Lilash. What then is it like to live through someone else's dream becoming true? Haber could not go on talking. He felt it, the shift, the arrival, the change. The woman felt it too. She looked frightened, holding the brass necklace up close to her throat like a talisman. She was staring in dismay, shock, terror out of the window at the view. What would it do to the woman? Would she understand? Would she command? What would she do? Would she keep both memories as he did, the true one and the new one, the old one and the true one? Does she go crazy? No, not at all. After a few moments of bewildered fugue, Heather Lilash accepts the new world as the true world, editing out the point of suture. This strategy of accepting the incommensurable and the senseless without question has always been the exemplary technique of sanity as such, but it has a special role to play in late capitalism, that motley painting of everything that ever was, whose dreaming up and junking of social fiction is nearly as rapid as its production and disposal of commodities. In this condition of ontological precarity, forgetting becomes an adaptive strategy. Take the example of Gordon Brown, whose expedient reinvention of his political identity involved an attempt to induce a collective forgetting. In an article in International Socialism, John Newsinger remembers how Brown told the Confederation of British Industry Conference that business is in my blood. His mother had been a company director, and I was brought up in an atmosphere where I knew exactly what was happening as far as business was concerned. He had always been one of them. The only problem is that it was not true, and his mother subsequently admitted she would never have called herself a businesswoman. She had only ever done some light administrative duty for a small family firm, and had given up the job when she married, 3 years before young Gordon was even born. While there have been labor politicians who have tried to invent working class backgrounds for themselves before, Brown is the first to try and invent a capitalist background. Newsinger contrasts Brown with his rival and predecessor as British Prime Minister Tony Blair, a very different case. While Blair, who presented the strange spectacle of a postmodern messianism, never had any beliefs that he had to recount on, Brown's move from Presbyterian socialist to New Labour Supremo was a long, arduous, and painful process of repudiation and denial. Whereas for Blair, the embrace of neoliberalism involved no great personal struggle because he had no previous beliefs to dispose of, Newsinger writes. For Brown, it involved a deliberate decision to change sides. The effort, one suspects, damaged his personality. Blair was the last man by nature and inclination. Brown has become the last man, the dwarf at the end of history, by force of will. Blair was the man without a chest, the outsider the party needed in order to get into power. His joker hysterical face, salesman smooth. Brown's implausible act of self-reinvention is what the party itself had to go through. His fake smile grimace. The objective correlative of labor real estate, now that it has completely capitulated to capitalist realism. Gutted and gutless, its insides replaced by simulacra, which one looked lustrous but now possesses all the allure of decade-old computer technology. In conditions where realities and identities are operated like software, it is not surprising that memory disorders should have become the focus of cultural anxiety. See, for instance, the Bourne films Memento, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. In the Bourne films, Jason Bourne's quest to regain his identity goes alongside a continual fight from any settled sense of self. Try to understand me, says Bourne in the original novel by Robert Ludlum. I have to know certain things, enough to make a decision, but maybe not everything. A part of me has to be able to walk away, disappear. I have to be able to say to myself, what was isn't any longer, and there is a possibility that it never was, because I have no memory of it. What a person can't remember didn't exist for him. In the film, Bourne's transnational nomadism is rendered in an ultra-fast cutting style, which functions as a kind of anti-memory, pitching the viewer into the vertiginous continuous present, which Jameson argues is characteristic of postmodern temporality. The complex plotting of Ludlum's novel is transformed into a series of evanescent event ciphers and action set-piece which barely cohere into an intelligible narrative. Bereft of personal history, Bourne lacks narrative memory, but retains what we may call formal memory. A memory of techniques, practices, actions that is literally embodied in a series of physical reflexes and tics. Here, Bourne's damaged memory echoes that postmodern nostalgia mode as described by Frederick Jameson, in which contemporary or even futuristic reference at the level of content obscure a reliance on established or antiquated models at the level of form. On the other hand, this is a culture that privileges only the present and the immediate. The extirpation of the long term extends backwards as well as forward in time. For example, media story monopolize attention for a week or so, then are instantly forgotten. On the other hand, it is a culture that is excessively nostalgic, given over to retrospection, incapable of generating any authentic novelty. It might be that Jameson's identification and analysis of this temporal antimony is his most important contribution to our understanding of most postmodern, post-40s culture. The paradox from which we must set forth, he argues in Antimonies of the Postmodern, is the equivalence between an unparalleled rate of change on all the levels of social life and an unparalleled standardization of everything. Feelings along with consumer goods, language along with built space, that would seem incompatible with such mutability. What then dawns is the realization that no society has ever been as standardized as this one, and that the stream of human, social and historical temporality has never flowed quite so homogeneously. What we now begin to feel, therefore, and what begins to emerge as some deeper and more fundamental constitution of postmodernity itself, at least in its temporal dimension, is henceforth where everything now submits to the perpetual change of fashion and media image, that nothing can change any longer. No doubt, this is another example of the struggle between the forces of the territorialization and reterritorialization, which Deleuze and Guattari argue is constitutive of capitalism as such. It wouldn't be surprising if profound and social and economic instability resulted in a craving for familiar cultural forms, to which we return in the same way that porn reverted to its core reflexes. The memory disorder that is the correlative of this situation is the condition which afflicts Leonard in Memento, theoretically pure anterograde amnesia. Here, memories prior to the onset of the condition are left intact, but sufferers are unable to transfer new memories into long-term memory. The new, therefore, looms up as hostile, fleeting, and navigable, and the sufferer is drawn back to the security of the old. The inability to make new memories, a succinct formulation of the postmodern impasse. If memory disorders provide a compelling analogy for the glitches in capitalist realism, the model for its smooth functioning would be dreamwork. When we are dreaming, we forget, but immediately forget that we have done so. Since the gaps and the lacunae in our memory are photoshopped out, they do not trouble or torment us. What dreamwork does is to produce a confabulated consistency which covers over anomalies and contradiction, and it is this which Wendy Brown picked up on when she argued that it was precisely dreamwork which provided the best model for understanding contemporary forms of power. In her essay American Nightmare, Neoconservatism, Neoliberal Anti-Democratization, Brown unpicked the alliance between neoconservatism and neoliberal, which constituted the American version of capitalist realism up until 2008. Brown shows that neoliberalism and neoconservatism operated from premises which are not only inconsistent but directly contradictory. How, Brown asks, does rationality that is expressly amoral at the level of both end and means, neoliberalism, intersect with one that is expressly moral and regulatory, neoconservatism? How does a project that empties the world of meaning, that cheapens and deracinates life and openly exploits desire, intersects one centered on fixing and enforcing meaning, conserving certain ways of life, and repressing and regulating desire? How does support for governance, modeled on the firm and normative social fabric of self-interest, marry a just elegant support for governance modeled on church authority and a normative social fabric of self-sacrifice and long-term filial loyalty, the very fabric shredded by unbridled capitalism? But incoherence at the level of what Brown calls political rationality does nothing to prevent symbiosis at the level of political subjectivity. And, although they proceed from very different guiding assumptions, Brown argues that neoliberalism and neoconservatism work together to undermine the public sphere and democracy, producing a governed citizen who looks to find solutions in products, not political processes. As Brown claims, the choosing subject and the governed subject are far from opposite. Frankfurt School intellectuals and, before them, Plato, theorized the open compatibility between individual choice and political domination, and depicted democratic subjects who are available to political tyranny or authoritarianism precisely because they are absorbed in a providence of choice and the satisfaction that they mistake for freedom. Extrapolating a little from Brown's argument, we might hypothesize that what held the bizarre synthesis of neoconservatism and neoliberalism together was their shared objects of abomination, the so-called nanny state and its dependence. Despite evincing an anti-statist rhetoric, neoliberalism is in practice not opposed to the state per se, as the bank bailouts of 2008 demonstrated, but rather to particular uses of state funds. Meanwhile, New Conservatism's strong state was confined to military and police functions and defined itself against the welfare state, held to undermine individual moral responsibility. Chapter 8. There's no central exchange. Although excoriated by both neoliberalism and new conservatism, I keep saying new conservatism, but it's new conservatism. Yeah, apologies, whatever. The concept of the nanny-state continues to haunt capitalist realism. The spectre of big government plays an essential libidinal function for capitalist realism. It is there to be blamed precisely for its failure to act as centralizing power, the anger directed at it, much like the fury Thomas Hardy supposedly spat at God for not existing. Time and again, James Beak observed in an LRB piece on water privatization in Britain, conservative and Labour governments have discovered that when they give powers to private companies, and those private companies screw up, voters blame the government for giving the powers away, rather than the company for misusing them. Beak was visiting Tewkesbury, one of the British towns that was the victim of serious flooding in 2007, a year after the disaster. On the face of it, the flooding and the consequent failure of service was the fault of privatized water companies and house builders, yet Meek found that this was not the way that most of the local residents saw it. In Tewkesbury, Meeks wrote, "In general, there is more hostility towards the government, the council, and the Environment Agency for not stopping house builders than there is towards house builders for building houses, or buyers for buying them. When insurers raise their premiums, more blame is directed at the government for not spending enough on flood defenses than at insurers for raising the premiums, or at people who choose to live in a flood-prone valley but don't like paying extra for it." This syndrome was repeated on a much grander scale with a disaster of a different kind, the bank crisis of 2008. The media focus was on the excesses of individual bankers and on the government's handling of the crisis, not on the systemic causes of the crisis. I don't for a moment want to excuse New Labour for its part in such disasters, but it has to be recognized that focus on government, like the focus on immoral individuals, is an act of deflection. Scapegoating an impotent government running around to clean up the messes made by its business friends arises from bad faith, from a continuing hostility to the nanny state that nevertheless goes alongside a refusal to accept the consequence of the sidelining of government in global capitalism, a sign perhaps that at the level of the political unconscious it is impossible to accept that there are no overall controllers, that the closest thing we have to ruling powers now are nebulous, unaccountable interests exercising corporate irresponsibility. A case of fetishist disavowal, perhaps. We know perfectly well that the government is not pulling the strings, but nevertheless, the disavowal happens in part because the centralness of global capitalism is radically unthinkable. Although people are interpolated now as consumers, and as Wendy Brown and others have pointed out, government itself is presented as a kind of commodity or service, they still cannot help but think of themselves as if they were citizens. The closest that most of us come to a direct experience of the centralness of capitalism is an encounter with the call center. As a consumer in late capitalism, you increasingly exist in two distinct realities, the one in which the services are provided without hitch, and another reality entirely, the crazed Kafkaesque labyrinth of call centers, a world without memory, where cause and effect connect together in mysterious, unfathomable ways, where it is a miracle that anything ever happens, and you lose hope of ever passing back over to the other side. Where things seems to function smoothly. What exemplifies the failure of the neoliberal world to live up to its own PR better than the call center? Even so, the universality of bad experience with call center does nothing to unsettle the operating assumption that capitalism is inherently efficient, as if the problem with call center others weren't the symmetric consequences of a logic of capital, which means organizations are so fixated on making profits that they can't actually sell you anything. The call center experience distills the political phenomenology of late capitalism, the boredom and frustration punctuated by cheerily piped PR, the repeating of the same dreary details many times to differentiate poorly trained and badly informed operatives, the built-in rage that must remain impotent because it can have no legitimate object since, as is very quickly clear to the caller, there is no one who knows and no one who could do anything even if they could. Anger can only be a matter of venting. It is aggression in a vacuum, directed at someone who is a fellow victim of the system, but with whom there is no possibility of communality. Just as the anger has no proper object, it will have no effect. In this experience of a system that is unresponsive, impersonal, centralist, abstract and fragmentary, you are as close as you can be to confronting the artificial stupidity of capital in itself. Call center angst is one more illustration of the way that Kafka is poorly understood as exclusively a writer on totalitarianism. A decentralized Marxist-Stalinist bureaucracy is far more Kafkaesque than one in which there is a central authority. Read, for instance, the bleak farce of Kay's encounter with the telephone system in the castle, and it's hard not to see it as uncannily prophetic of the call center experience. There's no fixed exchange with the castle, no central exchange which transmits our calls further. When anybody calls up the castle from here, the instruments in all the subordinate departments ring, or rather they would ring if practically all the departments, I know this for a certainty, didn't leave their receivers off. Now and then, however, a fatigued official may feel the need of a little distraction, especially in the evening and at night, and may hang the receivers on. Then we get an answer, but of course an answer that's a practical joke, and that's a very understandable too, for who would take the responsibility of interrupting in the middle of the night the extremely important work that goes on furiously the whole time with a message about his own private troubles. I can't comprehend how even a stranger can imagine that when he calls up Sortini, for example, it's Sortini that answers. Kay's response anticipates the bewildered frustration of the individual in the call center labyrinth. Although many of the conversation with call center operatives appear dadaistically nonsensical, they cannot be treated as such, cannot be dismissed as being of no significance. I didn't know it was like that, certainly, said Kay. I couldn't know of all these peculiarities, but I didn't put much confidence in those telephone conversations, and I was always aware that the only things of any importance were those that happened in the castle itself. No, said the superintendent, holding firmly onto the word. These telephone replies from the castle certainly have a meaning. Why shouldn't they? How could a message given by an official from the castle not be important? The supreme genius of Kafka was to have explored the negative ideology proper to capital. The center is missing, but we cannot stop searching for it or positing it. It is not that there is nothing there, it is that what is there is not capable of exercising responsibility. This problem is addressed from another angle in a paper by Campbell-Jones entitled "The Subject Supposed to Recycle." In posing the question who is the subject supposed to recycle, Jones denaturalizes an imperative that is now so taken for granted that resisting it seems senseless, never mind unethical. Everyone is supposed to recycle. No one, whatever their political persuasion, ought to resist this injunction. The demand that we recycle is precisely posited as a pre-post-ideological imperative. In other words, it is positioned in precisely the space where ideology always does its work. But the subject supposed to recycle, Jones argued, presupposed the structure not supposed to recycle. In making recycling the responsibility of everyone, structure contracts out its responsibility to consumers, by itself receding into invisibility. Now, when the appeal to individual ethical responsibility has never been more clamorous, in her book's Frame of War, Judith Butler uses the term responsabilisation to refer to this phenomenon. It is necessary to wager instead on structure, at its most totalizing. Instead of saying that everyone, i.e. everyone, is responsible for climate change, we all have to do our bit. It would be better to say that no one is, and that's the very problem. The cause of eco-catastrophe is an impersonal structure which, even though it is capable of producing all manners of effect, it is precisely not a subject capable of exercising responsibility. The required subject, a collective subject, does not exist, yet the crisis, like all the other global crises we're now facing, demands that it be constructed. Yet the appeal to ethical immediacy that has been in place in British political culture since at least 1985, when the consensual sentimentality of Live Aid replaced the antagonism of the miners' strike, permanently defers the emergency of such a subject. Similar issues are touched on in a paper by Armin Beverengen on Alan Pakula's 1974 film The Parallax View, which sees the parallax view as providing a kind of diagram of the way in which a certain model of business ethic goes wrong. The problem is that the model of individual responsibility assumed by most versions of ethics have little purchase on the behavior of capital or corporations. The parallax view is in a sense a meta-conspiracy film, a film not only about the conspiracy but about the impotence of attempts to uncover them, or much worse than that, about the way in which particular kinds of investigation feed the very conspiracy they intend to uncover. It is not only that the Warren Beatty character is framed guilt for the crime he is investigating, neatly eliminating him and undermining his investigations with one pull of a corporate assassin trigger. It's that, as Jameson noted in his commentary on the film in the Geopolitical Aesthetic, his very tenacity quasi-sociopathic individualism make him eminently frameable. The terrifying climatic moment of the parallax view, when the silhouette of Betty's anonymous assassin appears against my grand white space, for me now rhymes with the open door at the end of a very different film, Peter Weir's The Truman Show. But where the door in the horizon, opening onto black space at the end of Weir's film, connotes a break in a universe of total determinism, the nothingness on which existentialism freedom depends, the parallax view's final open door opens onto a world conspirationally organized and controlled as far as the eye can see. This anonymous figure with a rifle in a doorway is the closest we get to seeing the conspiracy as itself. The conspiracy in the parallax view never gives an account of itself. It is never focalized through a single malign individual, although presumably corporate, the interests and motives of the conspiracy in the parallax view are never articulated, perhaps not even to or by those actually involved in it. Who knows what the parallax corporation really wants? It is itself situated in the parallax between politics and economy. It is a commercial front for political interest, or is the whole machinery of government a front for it? It is not clear if the corporation really exists. More than that, it is not clear if its aim is to pretend that it doesn't exist, or to pretend that it does. There are certainly conspiracies in capitalism, but the problem is that they are themselves only possible because of deeper level structures that allow them to function. Does anyone really think, for instance, that things would improve if we replaced the whole managerial and banking class with a whole new set of better people? Surely, on the contrary, it is evident that the vices are engendered by the structure, and that while the structure remains, the vices will reproduce themselves. The strength of Pakula's film is precisely to invoke the shadowy centralist impersonality proper to a corporate conspiracy. As Jameson observed, what Pakula captures so well in the parallax view is a particular kind of corporate, affective tonality. For the agents of conspiracy, Sorge Conner is a matter of smiling confidence, and the preoccupation is not personal but corporate, concern for the vitality of the network or the institution, a disembodied distraction or inattentiveness engaging the absent space of the collective organization itself, without the clumsy conjectures that sap the energies of the victims. These people know and and are therefore able to invest their present as character in an intense yet complacent attention whose center of gravity is elsewhere, a rapt intentness which is at the same time disinterest. Yet this very different type of concern, equally depersonalized, carries its own specific anxiety with it, as it were unconsciously and corporately, without any consequence for the individual feelings. Without any consequence for the individual feelings, how that phrase resonates just now, after the death of Jean-Charles de Menes and Ian Tomlinson, and after the banking fiasco. And what Jameson is describing here is the mortifying cocoon of corporate structures, which deadens as it protects, which hollows out, absents the managers, ensures that their attention is always displaced, ensures that they cannot listen. The delusion that many who enter into management with high hopes is precisely that they, the individual, can change things, that they will not repeat what their managers had done, that things will be different these times. But watch someone step up into manager, and it's usually not very long before the great petrification of power starts to subsume them. It is here that structure is palpable. You can practically see it talking people over, hear its deafening judgment speaking through them. For this reason, it is a mistake to rush to impose the individual ethical responsibility that the corporate structure deflects. This is the temptation of the ethical which, as Zizek has argued, the capitalist system is using in order to protect itself in the wake of created crisis. The blame will be put on supposedly pathological individual, those abusing the system, rather than on the system itself. But the evasion is actually a two-step procedure, since structure will often be invoked, either implicitly or openly, precisely at the point when there is the possibility of individuals who belong to the corporate structure being punished. At this point, suddenly the causes of abuse or atrocity are so systemic, so diffuse, that no individual can be held responsible. This was what happened with the Hillsborough football disaster, the Jean-Charles de Menes farce, and so many other cases. But this impasse, it is only individuals that can be held ethically responsible for action, and yet the cause of this abuse and error is corporate systemic, is not only a dissimulation, it precisely indicates what is lacking in capitalism. What agencies are capable of regulating and controlling impersonal structures? How is it possible to chastise a corporate structure? Yes, corporations can legally be treated as individuals, but the problem is that corporations, whilst certainly entities, are not like individual humans, and any analogy between punishing corporation and punishing individuals will therefore necessarily be poor. And it is not as if corporations are the deep-level agents behind everything. They are themselves constrained by expression of the ultimate cause that is not a subject, capital. So, chapter 9 next time will be the grand finale of the book. This was super interesting. I mean, especially in recent events with climate change and all the discussion that there's been about responsibilizing people at an individual level